Hello, everyone. Welcome. Uh, hello, Krellin. Hello, Aradin. And for everybody else, my name is Ariana. I am the co-director of the Consent Academy, an international Seattle-based nonprofit that aims to promote consent as part of everyday life. Hi, Paladin Hulk. I am very excited to be here today, even though I want you to see my bangs are just like sticking out, and I don't know why. I can't get them to stop. I need a haircut so bad. I think I'm gonna have to just get a bobby pin and pin them to the side in just a second. Anyway, welcome. I'm very excited to be here. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, I hope you're having a wonderful day. And I'm very excited to have you all joining me. I see a lot of you are already saying yes to my question that I titled today's stream is Thanksgiving a trash holiday? Yeah, we're going to talk about it. Krellin, you said my gaming group didn't get together on Friday, but I nevertheless wished the Canadian a very happy time away from Americans. And Aradin, you said hair in your eyes is always annoying. It's true. It's true. Paladin Hulk, I've been cutting my own hair since the start of COVID. I highly recommend it. It may not look great, but oh boy, is it cheap. Yeah, I think I've mentioned before because of my hair's texture. Um, if I don't get it cut by like a really skilled professional, at least someone who actually knows how to deal with this kind of hair texture, it just looks really bad because like every cut will really show. So it's difficult. It's difficult, which is why I just don't get my hair cut very often. So I go and get my hair cut like 2 or 3 times a year by someone who's like kind of high end, and it kind of totals out to the average of like how often I would get my hair cut uh, if I were going someplace cheaper. But yes, I am very tempted to just cut my own bangs. I did that a few times, actually. Citizen Shades helped me cut my hair on my own for the first time I ever did it. Cut my bangs, and it looked horrifying. I made a big mistake. Cut my own bangs. Oh, he cut the bangs. Uh, I don't know if Citizen Shades is going to join today, but anyway, yeah, it was bad. It was bad. Also, it's kind of fascinating to like have someone I haven't talked to in decades at this point, who I dated when I was in high school, join. It's kind of wild. Uh, Most of the time, my experiences I've mentioned before with people I dated in high school is them sending me messages saying that they're still in love with me, and I'm kind of like, you dated me when I was 14. That was a long time ago, and you don't actually know me. But attachments, mental formations, ideas we have of people in our heads, uh, they're all legit. Oh man, I have a bunch of makeup on my keyboard. Look at that. Look at that. What did I do that for? Okay. Anyway, um, Aradini said, I didn't honestly realize the origins of Canadian Thanksgiving differed from American Thanksgiving. And then thank you for the compliment, Aradin. Yeah, I mean, I think that the way I view that is similar to the ways I view transference in therapy. So, transference can have a couple of different meanings in a therapeutic perspective. Transference can be like if I am angry at, X person, but I can't safely process it with X person, I will like transfer subconsciously my feelings to somebody else that is a safe target. So it's very common, like someone stressed and angry and upset at their boss, they can't express that to their boss, so they take it out on their partner or their children or their friends. But transference can also mean just like the relationship that you have with your patient. And it can also mean the ways that patients project onto their therapist. So it's got a couple of meanings in a therapeutic setting. But one of the big things is for a lot of people, the relationship you have with your therapist might be the first really supportive, really, like good relationship you've ever had. Like a lot of us, really are very lonely and have had a lot of relationships that were not very good for us, were not very sustainable, maybe cause some kind of, ache or long-term harm or some sort of high whistler issues. And so for a lot of people, it's very common for them to either do things like get a crush on their therapist or kind of treat their therapist like a parent or whatever sort of like need, because it's the first really safe, supportive, giving relationship they may have ever had. And so what I'm trying to say is I was a therapist to a lot of the people I dated in high school and university, and I think that's part of why a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them still have those feelings about me. There are also some that like hate my guts. And sometimes I'm like, legit, like, we were not good for each other. It's a good thing we don't talk anymore. And other people, I'm just like, you hate my guts because of the reasons why I broke up with you, because I didn't buy your bullshit anymore. Uh, but this is not me saying that I'm perfect at all. Like I said, there are some people who hate my guts that I dated, and I'm like, yeah, legit. We're just not in a good place to be dating. I wasn't in a good place to be with you. It happens. I believe my shit stinks just as much as anybody else's. Arada, you said, Paladin Hulk, you said, what if we renamed it to Thanks Taking and we say thanks for all the stuff we stole? Yeah, that brings me to like, I remember as a kid being taught the phrase Indian giver, which meant someone who gives and then takes back. And I was very confused why it was called Indian giver and not like settler giver or something. Because I was just like, I'm pretty sure it's the settlers and the US government who had made like a ton of promises and treaties and then just broke them. Still breaks them. Like there's a big push right now, like several nations, including the Cherokee Nation, have a treaty that says they are supposed to have their own representatives in Congress. And that has never been honored, but it was part of the treaty that was created when their land was ceded to become part of the United States, and like they're supposed to have representation. Okay. And I would also say, I agree, Krellin, that if we're gonna have Thanksgiving, it should just be a harvest festival. So I was actually planning originally to like talk about the real history of Thanksgiving today, but I don't totally have the energy for that because it's a complicated topic. There's a lot of myths around it. And it's also complicated for me personally because I'm both Indigenous on my mother's side, I'm Choctaw, and that's a very like big part of my identity. I'm not an enrolled Choctaw. I am very much disconnected. My grandfather was definitely not white passing, tried to pass as Mexican because he felt he would be treated better, left the South for New England because again he thought he'd be treated better, and really told my mom and her sisters to never tell anybody that we were Indigenous. And he felt it was incredibly dangerous for us to do so. And he had a lot of mixed feelings about his own heritage. And there were things that he taught me, and there were ways in which he only felt comfortable teaching me these things because of how white my skin is. And then on my dad's side, some of my ancestors were on the second voyage of the Mayflower. So I'm both OG colonized and OG colonizer in one. It's pretty great. It's pretty great, right? So it's a kind of complicated subject. And I definitely also don't want to come out here and try to say, like, I can speak for Indigenous people. I can only speak for myself and only on a good day. So, like, the things I think and feel are complicated. That's why I started with this comic by the great Ricardo Kate. If you don't know him, I really recommend checking out his comics. He's got a series called Without Reservations, and it's pretty cute. And I think that this comic kind of covers the general vibe in Indian country of, there are some natives who actively protest the holiday. There are some natives that it's their favorite holiday, and there's every kind of in between. So we've got this four-panel comic here. It's like a white guy going to an indigenous man's house, knocking on the door, and the white guy says, "I want you to come to my house for Thanksgiving dinner." And the indigenous guy says, "So you're inviting me to a colonizer celebration that perpetuates the genocide of Native Americans?" The white guy replies, "We're serving turkey." And the indigenous guy says, "I'll get my coat." And part of it is just like, good food is good food. And like, I definitely went to like a lot of neo-religious meetups like Scientology and like Happy Science when I lived in Tokyo. And there's a bunch of like very interesting new religions in Japan. But a lot of the time I went there because they had good free food. Like really, the Krishnas also had some of the best. Scientologists tended to have pizza, but a lot of the time I wanted pizza. So I went to a lot of those because food is food. And I was like, it's tasty. It's good. I'm down for this. Um, you're right, Krellin. I suspect we're serving, it took me a second to process what you're saying, that we're serving turkey is supposed to be a bit more sing-songy. And why it became an official holiday is also pretty complicated. So, like, one of the things to do with the history is that Thanksgivings were a common Puritan practice. Um, and they were not actually feasts, they were fasting celebrations, and you would have them anytime, all year round. And they were usually reserved for prayer, fasting, and shooting. For some reason, religion and guns have been real tied through all of American history. Um, and so that's what people would do is they would like have shooting games and they would pray and they would fast and they were very like somber events. And there are some sort of differing accounts that, Squanto, also known as Tisquantum, had a really good sort of relationship with the original settlers in Plymouth. Not that they were not the originals, there was like Virginia and Roanoke and all this stuff, but in New England. And that there was sort of liaison and they had a sort of mutual defense pact. And the one tribe sort of heard the gunshots of this Thanksgiving celebration, thought that the people were under attack, and like all showed up to defend them. That seems to be something that happened. And there are also situations where the New England's weather is a lot harsher than the British Isles' weather tends to be. The seasons are a lot more extreme in their differences. It's really hot and humid in the summer. Um, Charlie often is like, "Oh, and I'm from Kentucky, and I'm gonna show you it's like so much hotter and humider there." And then we look on the weather, and it's like the exact same. Massachusetts in August is disgusting. Try to avoid it. And then there's like blizzards every winter. And one of the other problems is that these people didn't really come prepared for a lot of this. They didn't really know what they were up against, and they didn't have a lot of money or resources. So there was a lot of the Native Americans, especially the give me a second, it just literally left my brain. I keep wanting to say the Massasoit, but that's not what I'm talking about. My brain is going through the lists of all the tribes in the area, and it's not the one I'm looking for. It'll come to me in a second. Anyway, the ones that like their reservation literally is bordering up onto the land used for the Plymouth Plantation Living History Museum. Um, oh, my camera's fully frozen. Wild. I'm sorry about that. I don't know why it's doing this these days. I checked last time that things were plugged in correctly and were plugged in where they should be. Very stuttery. I'm so sorry. What is going on? Give me 1 second. I will be right back. Can you hear me? It does seem like you can hear me. Okay. It is not me maintaining a single expression. I tried plugging my camera into a different um, port on the back just to see if it would work. There we go. Should be good now. Hopefully it does not keep stuttering. Hopefully. Yeah, I plugged it into a different one. I do see that, oh, hello, Jakey. Um, yeah, Wipe Out the Pilgrim stuff from it would be really good. So, there's a lot of complications there. One of the reasons why I do think it's a trash holiday is because it does, in a lot of American schools, it's very common for children to dress up as pilgrims and as Native Americans, which really, I think, normalizes um, playing Indian, which is not a good thing to do. And it normalizes a lot of erasure. It also, the story that's often told. I don't like the way Native American history is told. It's often considered to be like it's a niche subject. It's not considered to be part of the foundations of American history. We really start American history from the arrival of colonizers, which doesn't make any sense because Native Americans are still they eventually end up becoming part of America, and so what happens before colonizers come should be considered part of American history because it's what happened on that land. But there's also just like we often tell the stories though it's history is something that happened to Native Americans rather than something that we were equal participants in. And so I think it's really, yeah. Also, Krellin, to your point, pilgrims still run the world. Yeah, a lot of people who came early became part of the Boston Brahmins. Some of my ancestors were part of the Boston Brahmins. I'm descended from Roger Williams, also, who was like the first governor and founder of Rhode Island, and all of this stuff. Like, it's like I said, I've got a very but like some of my other Irish ancestors came during the Great Famine, and then I've got like it's I'm very much a mutt. Um, but in terms of the things I feel closest to, it's my Irish and my Choctaw heritage, and that's also very traditional. A lot of during at the time of the Trail of Tears, for example, the chief of the Cherokee Nation by heritage was 6/8 Scottish. So like the Eastern Woodland tribes had a lot of mixing, and even the original Pilgrims actually mixed a lot. The other thing that's left out of the Thanksgiving story is that there were Black people there. There was at least one Black guy that we know for sure was there. We do not know his name because he was basically just written as that Black guy on the manifest. But there was a Black man there, and does not seem to have been a slave, just was another pilgrim. And so, we tell the story, this very like ridiculous, hunky-dory whitewash story that doesn't even make any sense. It's not, and from what I understand, it was like made a holiday. Why it was made a holiday is contested. It's something seems to do with Abraham Lincoln and it being officially made a holiday like a week after he ordered the largest mass execution in American history, which was of a bunch of Native Americans who, yeah, were just trying to defend their land and their people. And yeah, like obviously there were massacres that were bigger, but like this was the largest official government ordered mass execution of prisoners in American history, and I think it was 13. I don't remember the tribe because I'm terrible. Anyway, I have a couple of resources to share. This again, just check out Without Reservations. It's a great comic series. He pretty much puts out a comic like every day. He's on Facebook. He's pretty active there. Um, because I think again, one of the other problems is and this is also a problem for like how sort of like Black stories are told, is we often really focused on just teaching about slavery, which I mean, like we should definitely learn about that, but that's not all of Black history. It's not just slavery and the civil rights movement and then hip hop. Like there's a lot more that happened. But we also have a tendency to really treat it as though, um, oh, what was I about to say? I literally just lost my thought. Oh yeah, we just focus on the trauma. And then we do the same thing with natives, and we're really focused on like the trauma narratives there. And well, I think that's good, and I think it's good for people to be aware of, atrocities and be aware of how those atrocities still impact things today. Not to make people feel guilty, because like whether or not people should feel guilty for these things is a lot more complicated. And my response to that a lot of time is you feeling guilty doesn't mean shit. It doesn't do anything for anybody. You feeling guilty is about you. And often people want to either really lean into that guilt. There's this kind of like, oh, what's the word? I had a word for it before. In philosophy, there's like this term guilt pride, where like people will talk about, oh, how guilty I am. Oh, I have so much internalized racism. Therefore, it gives me moral superiority. And we can, as I mentioned in a previous stream, this guilt pride is, as analyzed by like political philosophers, seen in a lot of the foreign policy of places like Germany, which is like so invested in guilt pride related to teaching of Nazi history and like really drilling it into people. But it's like a performance for the person who's experiencing guilt. And then or people get really uncomfortable with the guilt and then need to either like sublimate it, or they want to like attack it or deny it or separate themselves from it. Um and you know, it's always still about the experiencer. To me, guilt, it doesn't matter. It's not the goal, and it's not going to help anybody. It's more about like, do we want to do anything about this? And do we want to do anything to right wrongs in the past that still have effects today? Um, and that's a lot more interesting to me. And so whenever I talk about these things, I do want to stress my goal is not to make you feel bad. And if you're feeling bad, maybe kind of unpack like where is it coming from within yourself? Like if you feel guilty, if you start to feel like, oh, I hate myself in this way or that way, like I had to get rid of that sense in myself a long time ago, like being both descended from literal pilgrims and also Native American. Like I really had to work through that. Also being like the palest person in my mom's whole family. I meant to include some pictures today of my mom and my grandfather and like my cousins, because like I have Irish skin and I am aware of that. There are things about my face that sometimes when people look at me hard enough, they're like, you're not totally white, I bet. Like I was just at a wedding that was like half Chinese, and several people there asked me if I was half Chinese or Asian in general. I get that a lot. I got that a lot in Japan. But sometimes people kind of are like, why do you care so much about this? Like, you must have one indigenous ancestor from like the 1700s. And I'm just like, no, genetics is a funny thing. On my mom's side of the family, I am by far the whitest person. And so that also means that I get a lot of certain types of white privilege. Now, that doesn't mean my life hasn't been hard, as we always want to talk about, but it does mean that I'm taken more seriously. I'm given the benefit of the doubt more. I'm seen as more innocent. I've like literally witnessed this happen. I've witnessed the way my mom could be treated differently, and the ways that she gets more sexualized just for, even though she and I, our faces look literally almost identical, to the point that regularly, if I'm visiting her where she lives, people will think I am her. It's happened since basically after I hit puberty. People would just be like, would mistake us for each other. But she gets treated way different than me. And she's not particularly dark, but she's just less obviously white. That's also kind of a tangent. But anyway, continuing. Paladin Hulk, my eyes are European, got them there, grew them there. Yeah. Aradan, the goal of guilt should be to prevent you from doing the same thing again. That's it. But sadly, very few actually learn that lesson. Yeah, I think guilt I think guilt can be okay if it motivates behavior. That's positive. That's like healing behavior. If I feel guilty about something I did, usually the way I feel, my response to that is that it makes me remember something here is important to me that I'm not acting within my own internal consent about. Or I might have violated someone else's consent in a way that goes against my personal ethics or ethos. And to me, it's like, what is this emotion communicating to me? What is something, because that's what every emotion should be communicating something. And I think that's important to kind of investigate. Yeah. Yeah, reparations. Yeah, I'm also a big proponent personally of reparations. My way of thinking about it basically is like, if you're the CEO of if you become the new CEO of a company, and on your first day you want to see all the money, and you get all of this stuff about all the assets that you have, and you're like, oh, this is so great, like we're going to do so much stuff with all this, and then your accountants or your CFO bring you all the stuff about the debt, and you're like, I don't have to pay any of that back because I had nothing to do with any of that. I wasn't involved in making those decisions. Like, I don't have that debt. It doesn't make sense. Like, that would destroy your company. But that's kind of what we do with, like, capitalism was made profit or possible, and like the reasons why the wealthy nations are so wealthy is not because they're smarter or had more natural resources or anything. In fact, often they had fewer natural resources. They just used other people. And like there's a huge thing to be read. Like there's a really great book about how like Europe deindustrialized Africa and Asia, including India, like intentionally destroyed infrastructure, machinery, took away, a lot of like labor techniques, especially for fine production, and then used that to drive profit for themselves. Yes. Uh, anyway, lots of thoughts. Okay, so let's continue. I have a couple of resources I want to share. I want to just encourage you all to follow Vince Schilling. He is a Mohawk activist and author and journalist, writes a lot for Indian Country Today, and he and his wife Dolores are very, very interesting and cool people. And he does a lot of really good education and outreach, and I really recommend him, including here. He talks about the history of Thanksgiving and also Pocahontas, even though the two of them historically had nothing to do with each other. There are two things that are like heavily mythologized in American culture. There are a lot of people, for example, who think that they're descendants of Pocahontas who are definitely not, especially if they trace their genealogy to the Bowlings. The Bowlings are literally called within Matoka's tribe the Blue Bowlings because they just came out of the blue. They're a family that never actually existed. People sort of created it as a way to create a mythology around genealogy. A lot of I see it online all the time. I've met people in person who are like, I believe that I'm allowed to wear this headdress because I'm personally Pocahontas's descendant. And I'm like, no, even if you were, it wouldn't let you wear that dress, but another story. Then there's also this, this video. I feel like though one of the people in this video uses a slur now that I look at the faces. I don't remember, but there's an article. There's this really famous video that people love to post of like this woman saying fuck Christopher Columbus, and then after that she just goes and says the N-word. So it's like kind of annoying that people feel like they're entitled to use whatever tools or expression makes them feel empowered, even if it comes on someone else's back. Not cool. I don't know if this is that video, but it's an article, and I think that there might be a video that was on Teen Vogue attached. I'm trying to remember. There's also Indian Country Today has a really good article on Wampanoag. There we go. That's why I was like, why can't I remember? Literally, a good friend of mine is Wampanoag, and I am like, sorry. Uh, sorry, Hope. I did not mean to forget. Just couldn't remember. I was like, yeah. There's a lot of towns in the area in Massachusetts with different names of different tribes or tribal leaders. And for some reason, that's all my brain would go through was like this list of like Cape Cod's towns and everything. I was like, not what I'm trying to say. Anyway, there was a lot of intermarrying between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims. They had mutual defense pacts. Also, there's like this myth that the Pilgrims came to like an empty continent. And the one point I want to add there is like after first contact, conquistadors and Christopher Columbus came, they brought smallpox and they brought influenza that there was no immunity against, and it killed something like 98% of the population of North America. It's important to know that pre contact, North America had more people in it than all of Europe combined by a lot. It was very heavily populated. There were big nations, there were like, federations, there were empires, there were international trade routes, there was a lot going on. And you know, wiping out that many people that quickly meant that there were ghost towns for sure. Some of Krellin, you said vocabulary note. They wouldn't be conquistadors if there weren't people there for them to conquist. Exactly. Uh, there were places where there were nobody left. The whole town died. So some of the early settlers did come in to, completely built towns that were uninhabited, and they were like, sweet, we don't have to freeze to death or like rush to build something so we don't freeze to death. We have a place to stay. And this was not uncommon, but it doesn't mean that the continent was empty and like, Europe, for example, after the first wave of the Black Plague in the 1300s, population was absolutely decimated. There were tons, like the population got so low, it was like hundreds of years before it even got back to what it had been before the Black Plague, the first wave of the Black Plague. If North America, if the people of North America had any of that opportunity, a lot would have changed, right? If it hadn't been so quickly after first contact that people really did start coming, the population would have eventually rebounded. People would have come back. It would have made a big difference. And that opportunity was never given. That's all I'm going to say. Okay, there's also this other article from Teen Vogue separating fact from fiction. And I'm just going to paste all of these in here because, like I said, I also want to recommend following this person. Currently, her tweets are protected if you're not already following her because she is on that list of anti-fascist accounts that are being targeted for harassment. But she is also she's a contributor at Teen Vogue. She writes a lot of good stuff. I really want to recommend her. This is one of the things I want to do is like, I have a small platform here. I'm not coming out to try to say like, I'm the spokesperson for Native people and like, I'm an expert on this stuff. Like I basically just know myself and my family and like my Native friends, and I know a bunch about my tribe, and then I know a bit about Native issues sort of in the general pan-Indigenous issues. And I know some stuff about like, when I was living in Seattle, I tried to actually know about the Squamish and the Salish and the other tribes of the area. But for the most part, I'm not an expert on these things, so I'm much more interested in pointing you all in the direction of people I do think you should follow and read from, and yeah. So anyway, continuing, there is also, like I said, there are some natives that really protest Thanksgiving. This is even, I think, in Plymouth. Also, fun fact, I grew up in Plymouth. My parents met in Plymouth. My mom was not born in Plymouth. She was born in Texas, but my parents met when they were in high school. Um, yeah, some of my ancestors came there and just never left. I still have family that lives in that area. Um, anyway, there are protests, but it's complicated, right? Like it goes back to this comic where it's like good food is good food, and there are some natives where it's their favorite holiday. For me, it's my one of my least favorite holidays. I would say it's my least favorite after Christmas. Christmas being my least favorite because I think it makes people a little I don't want to say this, separated from their minds for a little while. Like just overwhelming consumerism and like the idea that you need to give so much and every year you need to give many things. And it's often stuff that people like it's just really wasteful and stressful and it puts people into debt because they feel like if they don't give to their kids or their family members, it means they don't love them. And like there's just all this messed up stuff going on with that. And I think that there are lots of things that happen related to Christmas that are really exploitative. Um, I also have beefs with a lot of holidays. Like, I don't really, there are things about Valentine's Day. I don't care that it's made up, all holidays are made up. That doesn't bother me. But like the mad rush to get like so many roses at that time period often means a lot of, um, very poorly paid migrant labor or slave labor is used. And yeah, so like I have a lot of thoughts about a lot of holidays, and I don't sort of want to just engage with them unthinkingly. I want to sort of investigate, why am I celebrating this holiday? Do I actually agree with it? I celebrate most Buddhist holidays because I am a Buddhist monk and yeah, like, the Buddha's birthday is a big deal and um, Obon and stuff like that. It's Japanese Buddhism, so most of the Japanese holidays are actually officially part of it. And so those are things I tend to celebrate. Um, but I also celebrate some American stuff. I love Halloween. Okay, so then there's one more funny thing I'll show you, and this is on Reddit's Indian Country. It's if you want to join, you can, but like if you're not native, don't say shit. Just like enjoy the witnessing. But here's this. Someone posted, "Would this be acceptable on Thanksgiving?" And it's pretty funny. It's a happy Thanksgiving cake, and it shows a shirtless pilgrim and a shirtless native guy, both very stereotypical, breaking a wishbone together. Both of them seem to have erections. Um, and would this be acceptable? And it's just pretty funny. It's pretty funny. And there's good comments here. There's the top comment is Indians and pilgrims are passing the gravy tonight at Ram Ranch's Thanksgiving blowout. Um, the OP commented at the first Thanksgiving they didn't eat turkey, they ate ass. They don't call us colonizers for nothing, but like with colon highlighted like colon and um, putting a loin back in loincloth. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty. And yeah, so that's one of the things to come back to is like, there's no one answer to this, and everybody's gonna have their reasons for what they want to do. Um, like it's a lot of times people also really want to sort of do the equivalent of the magical black person thing with natives and just kind of assume that all natives like are super in tune with nature and like know all this stuff, but like there are plenty of natives who are really pro oil and gas. And hi Jerry, welcome. Um, yeah, there is some cake on that cake. So it's like it's very diverse. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, let's get to some scenarios. This one was just from Reddit relationship advice. I'll put this in the chat as well. Um, and it says, is anyone feeling depressed and lonely on Thanksgiving? Some of these are a bit old because I wanted to do one specifically related to Thanksgiving as much as possible. I don't know, I can't explain it, but I'm feeling so depressed right now, like every muscle and feeling the feeling in my gut. I did force myself to meet my friend earlier and was surrounded by families and couples in public, but they're all strangers. I came home to silence and maybe even feel worse. It's been a rough year, still recovering from a breakup with a toxic narcissist. Lost my grandma after she was in the ICU, distanced myself during fallouts with friends and family. Home doesn't feel like home anymore, and it's been really busy, so I'm spending the holiday alone. I feel like crying, but I don't want to cry on a day I'm supposed to be happy. A few people messaged me Happy Thanksgiving, but it takes so much energy for me to even reply. Trying to be positive, feeling fragile, so would appreciate any words of encouragement or comfort. You're right, Krillin. There are several tribes whose wealth is based off of oil and gas, and Aradan, yes, the all natives and druids belief. Yeah, like it's weird. It's weird. So anyway, going to this post here, I just want to start by saying it's very common. I think it's more common than most of us think for people to feel actually lower in mood on holidays than happier. And some of it is because it's like prescribed happiness, like you're supposed to feel happy, and that puts a lot of pressure on you. And it's like a lot of people have really shit birthdays because they're like, oh my gosh, my birthday's supposed to be so big and so important. And I think that's why some people end up saying, okay, I'm gonna have a whole birthday week or a whole birthday month as a way to try to like offset some of that pressure, because then it's like it's not all about one day being good, it's about some number of all these days being good. But I think that it's normal. It's a lot. And sometimes when we don't just sort of transform suddenly into like happy people surrounded by friends and family on these holidays where every image we see of them is happy people surrounded by friends and family, we can feel more keenly the distance between who we are and who we want to be, where we're at and where we would like to be. And I think that makes it really hard for a lot of people. And especially if, it's sort of like a lot of people, the first time they try to meditate, they just fall asleep. And, or like in Japan, it's really common you go to any of like theaters, especially like No or Kabuki or even movie theaters, like 20 minutes in, half the audience is asleep, even though they may have paid a lot of money to be there. Because for a lot of people, they're so busy and so sleep deprived and so exhausted, the second they have a quiet moment to actually sit, they fall asleep because they're just that sleep deprived. And I think the same is kind of true in with holidays, where a lot of our life is really go, go, go. We have a lot of stresses, and then we may get a day off where most things are closed, and maybe, hi, Critwitch, welcome. And maybe a lot of people are really busy. And that makes the difficulties all that more easy to observe, sort of like the falling asleep at the theater, because normally you're able to kind of like push it away, and then suddenly, yeah. And Paladin Hulk, you said, okay, Paladin Hulk, you first said you were forced to spend time with family, rejoice even if they're awful. Yes. Right, and you also said there should be no days that are supposed to be happy, for sure. Roddenwell sounds like situational depression on top of normal depression, and Paladin Hulk, you mentioned seasonal depression or maybe regular depression. For sure, this definitely sounds like this person's depressed. If they've been distancing themselves, if they're feeling more and more tired, if they're finding it more difficult to enjoy things that they normally enjoy, if they're finding, yeah, those are all very like characteristic symptoms of depression. Especially if they've been going on for more than 6 months. That's where you start to get into very diagnosable conditions rather than something like situational depression. Like it's normal to feel depressed after someone breaks up with you or you get out of a bad relationship, but it's something where you should have a time period that you then process and you move on from. Whereas if it really persists after that and lasts for a long time. Yeah. Um, and Paladin, like you said, this person distancing themselves from friends and family is a big sign of depression, and that was before Thanksgiving even came up. Absolutely. Paladin or Aradin, you said, also some people don't have that type of friends, and so they can feel that something is wrong with them, and they don't, as we always highlight, the more extroverted type of birthday party. Yeah, and I think this is absolutely true, where it's like there's no one right way to live life. There's no one right way to experience friendship or family or even romantic relationships, right? And so sometimes people, though, can feel like my reality doesn't match what I've been told it's supposed to look like. That must mean something's wrong. Um, Crit Witch, I hope you are not having to fight something viral. Um, and I hope you just feel better. I've definitely had a few of those days recently where like I have a day where I'm kind of like, I'm pretty sure I'm getting sick. Like everything hurts. Like I know last weekend I was like, all my joints hurt. Um, and I felt like really bad. And then it was literally like a day. And I was okay. My stomach is still having problems. Again, I think I might actually be lactose intolerant, which would really suck. But I really hope, Crit Rich, for you, you get better and there's nothing going on. Um, and yes, Aradin, try telling popular media that, it's just really difficult. And I think that it's really, people can feel like there's something wrong with me because I don't match what I've been told I should. And it's one of the things that I think is really sad is because no matter what you're experiencing, there are probably hundreds of people out there experiencing the same thing as you, at least hundreds. We have 8 billion people on the planet, right? 8 billion is like a monstrously large number. And I'm not saying it's too many, that I'm not going anywhere near that kind of talk, but very, very much the idea of no matter what you're experiencing, there are probably a good number of people out there, many more than you think, who understand. So nobody is actually that weird. It can be a bit deflating if you like want to be weird, but like nobody is really that strange. So whatever it is that's going on in your life, you're not alone in it. You just maybe haven't found the people who are having the same experiences as you. That's one of the things the internet can help with. That is one of the actual things I think the internet is good at doing, which is helping you find like-minded people. Sometimes it helps people who are shitty Nazis find other shitty Nazis, which is unfortunate because then it can make them feel like their beliefs are more commonplace and amplify it. But, it can also still do good and you can find people. But also, even if you don't find anybody else, it's okay. It's really okay. And yeah, so if you have difficulty with the holidays, I just want to say you're not alone. For sure. Aradin, you said, I'm an asexual introverted male with low self-esteem and self-worth. I am so far from what we see in most media. Yeah, I mean it's really unfortunate. And I have a lot of thoughts about like LGBTQ plus representation in media where it's like gotten very mainstream and very sanitized, where like people accuse all of it of being queer baiting, but then also like don't want to actually see gay shit. Like they don't want to see stuff that is like, here's what queer culture is like. Here's what your elders were doing. Here's what people even like a few years younger than or older than you were probably doing. And then we also have tons of identities that are completely left out still. Occasionally we have asexual characters, but there's often, I think in most of the representation I've seen of asexual characters, it's like they're very good looking and the asexuality is almost like create there for a certain type of tension building. Um, or to sort of like contrast, like, oh, isn't it so surprising that someone who's this attractive would be asexual? Um, Yeah, I have lots of thoughts about it. Okay, so continuing, let's look at some other scenarios. This one is just fun. What should be a crime but isn't? I'm not actually going to go through it. I just want you all to enjoy it and add your own thoughts because I think it's pretty funny. There's some very, very good things like dark money in politics and lobbying. I mean, I think money in politics in general needs to be, yeah, fact, all money in politics. Politicians being able to invest in stocks, I also agree with that. Um, Krillin, you say I watched a show with an espoused asexual who was very hot and also ended up in a lesbian relationship in the end. I mean, yeah, yeah. It's just frustrating. It's just frustrating. Um, yeah, I think this thread is really good. It's really good. Okay, continuing. This one is just a boring dystopia. I know this is what I normally share on Tuesdays, but I just wanted to talk about this one really quickly, where it's an article that says, "Can you hear it? Sonic devices play high-pitched noises to repel teens." It seems like it's on NPR. And then the text that the Redditor wrote was repelling teenagers from public parks using sonic weapons, quote, in a city that is trying to address gun violence and safe spaces for young people, Jim said. How dare we come up with ideas that are funded by taxpayer dollars to turn young people away from the very places that were created for them? And I think this is absolutely true, but I also think it's just not very consensual in general to do something that's supposed to inflict pain on people in order to modify their behavior. Because until pretty recently, I could still hear these sounds. And it's not comfortable. It like hurts your ears. And it's wrong. It's just wrong to like non-consensually inflict pain on people because you feel that they don't belong. I really hate, especially when it's outside of like convenience stores or like places that don't want loitering to happen because it's like one, you're mostly going to be affecting young children. Like, really, it's mostly going to be young children. A lot of people lose the ability to hear those frequencies pretty early by the time they're teens, a lot of times because of like earbuds and listening to really loud music, and the world around us is just super noisy. But, like, yeah, this is just not how you do it. That's not good consent. And it's also not going to create a solution because if you just push people away from one place and destabilize like centers of community building, one, you're going to make community building a lot more fragile, but you're also just, you're not sending those people home to go sit quietly and like read the Bible and like, you know, have pure thoughts and never do anything wrong ever. Like, no, they're going to just go look for somewhere else. And it's going to be places that are probably not as good and more risky. Anyway, Whistler, you said, I was fascinated to learn that the timing of Spain's invasion of the Americas, beginning in 1492, was no coincidence. 1492 marked the end of the Spanish expulsion of Muslims from the Iberian Peninsula, a war that had been waged for centuries. Spain was left with a large number of former soldiers who had no other skills. Instead of trying to reintegrate them back into civilian life, Spain sent them around the world so they wouldn't have to deal with them. Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing this because this is one of those things where like there's so much that we've mythologized and also like intentionally left out of how we talk about these things and how we teach this history. Yeah. Arad and the Imperfects is the only media I can think of that had a good representative of asexuality. Um, Krellin, that was the show I was talking about Aradin, and then Aradin, you say to Krellin, well, gray ace is a thing. Well, I don't think they're actually trying to solve things. They just want them not to have to see them. Okay, yeah, two separate comments. Yeah, with the imperfects, I think that, there are people who are asexual but not aromantic. And there are people who, are aromantic but not asexual. Like there's a ton of different diversity of different types of sexuality. Gender, I've talked before that like I very much consider myself gray gender because yes, I'm assigned female at birth and like I have breasts and a uterus and all this other shit and like I can nominally bear children. but like I don't even have any feelings about those things. I'm kind of just like, I guess that's what my body does. Sure. And like I'm not the kind of person who's like, I feel so connected to womanhood through my men. No, I don't give a shit. I'm just like, this is annoying, and I forget that it even is a thing that happens to me until my phone reminds me that it's gonna start in a day or two. And like, yeah, that's just I don't have any feeling about it. And I think that that's um but then when it comes to my sexuality, I'm definitely attracted to all genders. And I definitely, can oscillate between being very like hypersexual, where it's like, I want to have sex with someone, I don't even need to know their name. In fact, it's probably better if they don't say a word to me because they might kill it, to very demisexual, where I need to have a real connection with you before I can experience sexual attraction or even romantic attraction. For me, romantic attraction is often the one where like I really need to feel a connection before I'll start to even feel romantically interested in people, which is why most of the people I've dated was friends with first, because I just experience it in this way where it's like I might find someone sexually attractive right away, but the romantic attraction takes time, and sometimes the sexual attraction takes time too. And sometimes they're not related at all. I can have people that I'm romantically attracted to, but don't want to touch them. And I can also have friend crushes where, like, it's similar to a romantic crush, but it's towards friendship rather than romance. We've talked about these things before, but I think that this is one of those things that media doesn't do a good job talking about all of these different nuances. And one of the reasons why I think it doesn't do that good of a job is because it often doesn't actually name what's happening. It's kind of left to the audience to just sort of like infer or like guess. And while it might seem weird or contrived sometimes, I still think it can be good to really name what's going on here, because I think that that's really important. Um, I'm not a big fan of like thinking that everything has to be reduced to labels, but just being kind of like forthcoming with what are we actually talking about in this media? What is the thing we're actually trying to represent? Can we, even see the characters themselves really naming what's happening and what they're experiencing? Um, and I think sometimes shows do that, but it's still often pretty big boxes that they're putting them into rather than things that are sort of more complicated. Um, Whistler, you said, I'm struggling to think of an example of male asexuality that isn't also autism spectrum disorder in media. Yeah, that's also a big thing. Is like, I think we have such a strong idea that like the essence of masculinity is like, insatiable sexuality. That when a man is asexual, we have to think of them as somehow being like, there has to be some other thing to explain it. And it's silly. It's silly. I wish Paladin, or not Paladin Hulk. I'm Paladin Hulk. I'm glad you're here. I was looking at your name, but I wish Academic Foxhole or Trooper were here, because I'm sure he could say so much more about all this. Like, he knows so much more queer history than I do. I'm merely a student in his class. Not actually, I'm not actually taking his classes, but Paladin Hulk, you said, at Aradan, if you want another show, the reboot of the Australian Heartbreak High has one as well, and I quite liked that show. Um, and Aradan, you said, I have friend crushes a lot. It isn't as easy to create drama with things outside of the norm. It's true. Yeah, I mean, like, these are all, yeah, difficult. So yeah, the only thing I really wanted to say about this uh, is not very consensual. This is not a consensual way to tackle any problems. Okay, let's do some Am I the Asshole posts. Krillin, you say women were the hypersexual sex until the sexual revolution. Yeah, it's so funny because we like have these ideas that history, that women were always these like super chaste, like only for their husbands. It's only because of like music videos and like fashion and TikTok that all these kids are having sex these days. And it's like you do realize like why the like vibrator was invented, right? It's because like bored housewives were so horny all the time. They were basically having mental health issues because they were like, I mean, they weren't having mental health issues because they were horny, but basically their lives were absolute shit. They were really understimulated. They were really horny. They weren't having orgasms from their spouse. And so they would go to the doctor, and the doctor would literally just masturbate them into orgasms. And that was like pretty common in Europe in the 1800s. And so it's just wild to me. It's just wild, especially when people are like, "I'm a trad wife. I want to have a trad. I want to do like that." I'm like, "What tradition? When? When is the thing you're imagining? When was it actually happening? And did the people who were participating in it actually like it? Were things actually good? Probably no. Probably no." But it's just so funny to me where it's just like people have these really, really wild ideas about like the history of women's sexuality, as though like there's one history, first of all, and as though it's the same in every country. It's not. But yeah, yeah. There's Dr. Eleanor, I think it's Janega. I don't remember her last name. She is a medieval historian and has a lot of really good things to say about medieval women's sexuality. And even in that book that I have, The Time Traveler's Guide to Medieval England, they have a ton of stuff in there about sex and sexuality and like how most of like the songs that were really popular among the people and like the jokes at the time had to do with like horny, insatiable wives and like, yeah, Rodden, also, people always assume there's only one tradition when they say stuff like that. Yeah, exactly. And zero, yeah, white 1950s tradition, but even then, it's like, I think that if you went back to the 1950s and looked at any couple, it would be pretty hard to find any that like fit this fantasy that we have. I think pretty much all of them would be exceptions. It's like every individual is an exception to the rule is a thing. And I think that's what people would find if they went back and really looked at any given couple. They would be like, oh, here's how it doesn't fit that, and here's how it doesn't fit this, or it does fit, and like she wants to poison her husband, or she's like drugged up all the time to manage it, or like, their kid grows up to have all these like problems because he just watched his mother just be like horribly depressed her entire life and drunk all the time. And like, yeah, okay. Here again, I said Thanksgiving edition, so let's look at a couple of these. Am I the asshole for leaving Thanksgiving dinner after my sister-in-law got snarky with me and some people started defending her? So, we always talk about these from a consent lens. So, not necessarily whether or not a person's an asshole or not, because that's such a subjective thing. Um, you're right, Sherry, that most traditions are based around an ideal that doesn't match reality. Um, and anyway, I just want to start by saying, like, you always have the right to leave. Like, that is the main way you can set a boundary. Like, boundaries are not saying you're not allowed to do this thing. Like, I can't say to Charlie, you're not allowed to be friends with this person. I mean, like, I would never try to dictate who he's friends with. And I've said to Charlie a million times, like, hey, if you ever like start to think you're getting a crush on somebody or like feeling sexual desire for somebody, just talk to me about it. Like, I'm not going to be mad. I'm not going to like try to like make it so you never see that person again. I would just want to investigate with you. Like, are there needs that are not being met? Or like, are we going to have a threesome or something? Like, I try to be very like real about things. I've got a particular type of pragmatism that sometimes makes me wonder if there's something wrong with my brain. Um, but I would never say to Charlie, you're not allowed to be friends with this person because that's an ultimatum. And like, if you do this thing, I'm going to do this. Like, that's not boundary setting. Boundary setting is saying, hey, I don't want to be a part of this thing, or I don't want you to keep doing this thing to me, or I don't want to be in this situation where this thing is happening. And if you continue to do this thing, here's how I'm going to exit this situation. I'm not going to say you can't do it. I'm not going to force you to stop. I'm not going to even try to stop you, but here is where like my comfort with what's happening ends. And if it exceeds that, I'm going to leave this situation. So, it's also like when we had SAR on a few weeks ago, I think for Halloween, we were talking about, um, codependent, enmeshed, or really independent couples. And like, if there's something I really want to go do, like say there was a movie I really wanted to go see in theaters and Charlie didn't want to go see it, I would just go, right? Like it would not be a thing. It wouldn't be a thing. Like it wouldn't be a problem because we don't see each other having different wants and desires as a threat. We're both very like secure in our attachment to each other. And as having differences, even us saying like, oh my gosh, that person is so good looking, like I take pride sometimes in being able to accurately guess if he's going to think someone is cute or good looking. He's got a very predictable type, and it's pretty fun. But, you know, it's not, we talk about it. It's fine. And like if I wanted to go see a movie that he didn't want to go see, I would just go see it. Or if he really wants to go do something and I just want to be a homebody that day, I don't want that to stop him from going and doing things. And I say this because people can feel a lot of anxiety around having to have everything be really together. And I think people get that way a lot about the holidays. People can get really focused on if we're not all together, that means something is wrong. And like everybody has to be smiling. We all have to be happy. We all have to bite our tongues about whatever is coming up. And that's just oppressive. And it's not very consensual because people need to have the ability to say no for it to be consensual. If they don't actually have the ability to say no, or if there would be, undue consequences or punishment as a result of saying no, then it's not consensual, right? Like they would be getting into an ultimatum space. And so it gets tricky. So let's actually read what more of the situation says. I'm 27-year-old woman, not close to my sister-in-law who's 26. We're not at each other's throats or anything, but she just seems to be slacking off sometimes. I've tried to help her out a bit and talk to her, but she never wanted to hear it. Sister-in-law recently got a new entry-level job that she'll be relocating for. We celebrated Thanksgiving with my husband's 27-year-old man's family this year, and it was a massive get together. A lot of people congratulated sister-in-law on her new job, which is understandable. However, my in-laws were acting like they won $1 billion. Some relatives kept asking about sister-in-law's new job, when she'll be moving, etc. I tried to change the topic, but my sister-in-law got kind of pissed and said something like, "You don't have to be part of this conversation." I replied that we're all proud of her. Maybe people want to talk about some other things too. Sister-in-law again got very snarky and said, again, leave the conversation. So this is one of those things that's tricky because the sister-in-law has a right to talk about this. Now, people can be bad conversationalists. People can be very selfish conversationalists. I would say most of us are not that good at conversation. I taught communication skills for like more than a decade professionally, and I still teach them through consent work. And I can be pretty bad at conversation sometimes. There are times where like I've got something in my brain that I can not let go of, and that's all I'm going to talk about. There are times where I just sort of like check out of conversations, etc. But people still are allowed to talk about what they want to talk about. And if people are wanting to participate in it, that means it's okay. Now, you can have things that go wrong where people can be trying to be gracious and polite when they're really not interested, and the person who's talking doesn't pick up on it, and other people might try to help, right? Like there's lots of things that are going on, but like the in-laws, her sister-in-law's parents and family feeling like they won the lottery and are so happy for her, there's nothing wrong with that. And wanting to talk about other things, like this woman can just go and have a different conversation with somebody else. They can just leave. See, again, this is the difference between like setting a boundary and trying to like kind of control what somebody else is doing. So this person's allowed to talk about this, But the woman who posted this, does not need to be a part of it. She could say, I would like to talk about something else. And, you know, so I'm not saying who is the asshole. I haven't actually finished reading this all the way. So I'm just kind of talking about like the woman is allowed to talk about what she wants to talk about. And the original poster is also allowed to leave. If they don't want to be part of a conversation, they're allowed to leave. And if they feel that they're being mistreated in a situation or they're not happy with how they're being treated, they're allowed to leave. You're really, that has to be part of consent, is you need to be allowed to leave situations. And so basically, this is a situation where both people's autonomy is bumping into each other, right? They're sharing a space. They have different needs that contrast with each other. That's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. And they need to negotiate, but if they negotiating in this way is much more difficult. In the moment sort of negotiations, changing things as they're already happening, it's much harder. I need to take a drink. So let's continue a little bit. I'll admit I got annoyed at that point and said, coming from the woman who's milking compliments or something almost most people achieve by the age of 16. So this is a pretty not nice thing to say, right? Like, again, you can be affirming someone's consent and violating someone's consent at the same time. It can be in all different directions, affirming and violating happening simultaneously. And saying unkind things to somebody just because you're upset is not good consensual behavior. And there are better ways to express these feelings. Now, I'm not the kind of person who wants to say you have to be perfectly, effective and like diplomatic all the time. Like, no, that's not the point. And you're allowed to express how you feel and not be skillful about it. It's okay. But this would still warrant an apology. Getting an entry level job, like if you're 26 and you've struggled to get a job, getting a job is still a big breakthrough. If I've been like depressed for years or like struggling for years and I start to make, it's like if I'm depressed, I will get bouts of depression where like feeding myself, getting out of bed at a reasonable time, showering, all of that stuff can become a challenge. And celebrating when I manage to take these really baby steps to managing my depression is not ridiculous, even though like, a lot of people in the world shower every day or every couple of days. Me being like, yes, I got up and I just like got showered and I put clothes on and I like got ready for the day. That's good to celebrate. And I think it's nice that this person's family wants to support them. Okay. My sister-in-law got really mad and said I have no position saying that. There were a few people around that started going off at me. I eventually walked off and told my husband I was leaving. He didn't know what was going on at that point, but in the heat of the moment, I just took the car and left. A cousin ended up dropping him off at home. So, yeah, I mean, like, this is not a nice thing to say to somebody. Other people kind of saying, like, yo, dude, what the fuck? You can't say that to her is legit, like, and it's also her right to leave. Now, it would be good consent practice to talk to a person who's also depending on you for a ride about what's happening. At the very least, like you go outside and you cool off for a little bit and then text your partner and say, hey, here's the deal. Do you want to come home with me now? Do we want to find another way for you to get home? Some communication here would have been better consent practices. So continuing, my sister-in-law is obviously pissed at me and my husband heard the whole thing. He said I created a scene for no reason and should apologize to sister-in-law, even though people started going off at me. I mean, people are going off at you because you were an asshole for what you said. Now this might be true. Like, I don't know enough about this situation. This could be true, but does it actually need to be said? See, this is one of those things is like, I do think that there's good practices in terms of communication. It's like, does this thing need to be said? Does it need to be said now? Does it need to be said by me? Is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? Is it cringy? If it's like, if the answers to these things do not get you to saying, yes, I should say this thing, sometimes it's good to just not, right? There's a difference between like holding your tongue when like one of your relatives is saying some really, really like offensive things and just letting people be themselves. There are also times where pushing back against somebody's, behavior can actually be good, right? We don't have to always just be like totally the most gentle with each other 24/7. Like if somebody I know is saying something, say, really sexist, I can just be like, yo, what the fuck? That's really sexist. Or like, I don't like that. Don't say that kind of shit around me. And that can be a thing that changes someone's behavior because they can be like, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. I shouldn't say that kind of thing. And if this person, I don't know, I assume getting an entry level job, 26, I assume there's something going on there. It could be that they're like super entitled and spoiled and didn't try. It could be that the economy has been bad. It could be that they had some mental health issues going on. This isn't necessarily necessary to be said, and definitely not at Thanksgiving. Is this person trying to set a boundary or making a bid, more like saying, I would like to change the subject, not doing it very skillfully. They're trying to express something. Yeah. I would agree with the husband that, like, yeah, you should probably say sorry. People going off on you, even if the other people in the room said things to you that were also really not okay, that doesn't change what you said to your sister-in-law. Okay, I shared this with my mom and she said I wasn't wrong and people are coddling sister-in-law. I get that I might have overreacted a bit, but I think it was justified. Am I the asshole? So you're not the asshole for leaving dinner. You're always allowed to do that. Not good consent practice to not tell your husband what's going on before you take off with the car and make him then have to get a ride home from a cousin. Was this really putting the cousin out? What would have happened if the cousin couldn't give them a ride? Like, there are better, especially if there's like a expectation, right? You've already talked about driving home together. Yeah. And yes, you can have other conversations too. You could just go into another room and it's like, okay, I want to go talk about something else. Okay, so let's look what other people are saying. So this person says, you're the asshole, you sound bitter or jealous. Yeah, I would say that like this is missing reasons kind of emotional argument that like there's a lot going on here that we don't know, but I'm trying to just talk about it from a consent perspective, what's going on there. And I'll share this link in here about missing reasons. I haven't read this before, so I can't attest to if it's good or not, but it was included. I'm gonna close out of that one. And I'm gonna close out of these other tabs, sorry. So yeah, I think that this is yeah. Let's look at what else people are saying. A lot of people are just talking about this article and liking it. Someone said agree, OP clearly doesn't like sister-in-law and they were spoiling for a fight. Yeah, maybe. This other person said, absolutely, you're the asshole. Listen, you've been making this woman miserable for ages. Now with your, I've tried to help her out a bit and talk to her, but she never wanted to hear it. And now you do not want to let her celebrate when she does make a positive change. Maybe stay home next time so every single other person can enjoy the day. Yeah. I mean, it's difficult. Like, why were you doing this? Constantly offering unsolicited advice. These things happen a lot where people can get so used to the dynamic of, and I'm not actually speaking necessarily to this situation because I don't really know what's going on, but people can get really used to the dynamic of, I'm the person who's got my shit together and I'm helping you and you never listen to me. And if only, if only, if only, remember we talked about these if onlys and how they can make a lot of things harder. If only you would do what I say, everything would be better. But if they actually start to make positive changes, that can make it so that reality feels like it's doesn't vibe anymore because you're just like, wait a second, you're not who I thought you were. And you're not like, you're changing. It's also how people can feel when they find out their exes have changed, and like especially in positive ways, because they're like, I want you to continue to be the asshole in my head in the story, when it's like, oh yeah, I mean, probably most people are going to improve, especially, someone that you, for example, dated in high school or college who maybe you broke up with for X, Y, and reasons, 20 plus years later, you would hope that they had developed as a person. And I would feel bad for someone who didn't, rather than be like, oh, you can't have changed. We do this a lot with people when we're trying to help them. We can get really used to being the dispenser of wisdom, the person with the more power, the whatever. And yeah, Rod and I also have this question. Did this happen while people were just sitting around or like during a dinner? Context also matters there. Okay, so let's look at another situation. This one is also tangentially related to Thanksgiving, but I want to actually skip this one and read another one. Yeah, I think so. Okay, so this one says, am I the asshole for telling my parents I won't spend the holidays with them this year unless they properly apologize and pay me back for canceling on me last minute last year? My camera just went out of focus. Why? Um, there we go, it's back. So this, I would say, sounds like this person is setting a boundary. You canceled on me last minute last year. I don't want that to happen again. You never said sorry. It put me out, and I would like help recuperating the costs. If you do not agree to these things, I'm not going to come. It's a bit of an ultimatum, but it's also a boundary, right? It's saying like, I want to feel our relationship as more equitable before I'm down to further invest in it. If you're not down to like do these things that I feel I need to feel like the relationship is more equitable, then I'm going to set a boundary here and I'm not going to keep investing in it. So I would say, yeah. Okay, so let's look at this. This story requires some background information. Around this time last year, my parents asked me if I wanted to come over for Christmas. I told them sure. I live abroad, so I don't see them very often. The plan was for me to arrive December 22nd and go back on January 7th. Our relationship was very rocky when I was a child due to my dad's mental health and anger issues, but he's in therapy for that now. I'm in therapy as well for the diagnosed PTSD his issues have given me. This will be relevant later. Okay, so I think that the rocky relationship, this context is also something that we talk about a lot in our consent classes about it's something that affects consent, right? How long you have known somebody and the type of relationship you have with them affects how comfortable you're going to be to say yes, but also how comfortable you're going to be to say no. If I have had, nothing but positive experiences with you, and you're older than me and you're trusted in our community or whatever, I'm going to be a lot more likely to say yes to you, even if that situation then goes wrong later. And that's just the nature of having experience. If I've had a lot of difficulty in my relationship with you in the past, I'm also more likely to potentially not feel comfortable saying yes, but I could also feel not very comfortable saying no. And there's also likely to be the emotional aspect that reduces capacity, which is what if I want to have this connection with people? And we can build up expectations around that. But, it sounds like the plan was pretty clear, December 22nd to January 7th. Okay. I bought myself a round trip train ticket for the long ride home as I don't have a car and I have really bad plane anxiety. Around December 15th, my mom called and asked me if I could bring back some of those cookies that she loves, and I tell her, of course. I decide to get them on the 21st so they're still super fresh upon arrival. I also bought some breads and sweets for my siblings. The total came down to about $40. I'm a student, and due to my chronic illness and heart condition, I can't work a lot, so money is tight, and I had to take some money out of my savings for this to afford all of it, but I didn't mind. Okay, so this is also something that is contextually important for consent, which is that is everybody okay with the things that are going to be actually being asked of them? Like asking me to come home for Christmas is not an easy decision, as that would be probably thousands of dollars in plane tickets for me because I live on a different continent than my family. And I would need to explain to them, here is the impact that paying for this would likely have on me. I'm down to do this, but are you also comfortable with that? Or are you willing to help at all with this? And having these kinds of conversations before you get into the situation is often advisable because it makes it a lot easier to talk about these things up front than it is after the fact. Okay, fast forward to the evening of the 21st. I'm on the phone with my dad telling him I got the cookies mom asked for and that I have to get up at 7 to get to the train station. I'm super excited to see them again. Out of nowhere, he tells me that won't be necessary because he and my mom are leaving for some island in the Caribbean the next day. I asked him how long they've been planning this, and he told me that they decided 2 days prior. So this is definitely like pretty bullshit, right? Um, to sort of just change these plans really suddenly, not communicate about it. These plans are going to impact other people. We don't really talk about the idea of impact awareness as part of like a pillar of consent, but it is something we talk about sort of around it, which is that, you know, were agreements and boundaries set? Yes, they made this agreement together and now they're changing it. You have to talk about that, right? Like we often talk about the person who's the most responsible for obtaining consent in any given situation. People will often say, like, if we ask, like, who's responsible for obtaining consent, everybody will be like, all people involved. And it's like, to a certain extent, yes. But the more nuanced answer is whoever is changing the situation that was already consented to. So I might be consenting to sit with you at a cafe, but if you want to hold my hand, you're changing the dynamic of the situation. Now, nonverbal consent is a thing. I'm not saying that you have to like pre-ask me necessarily. Some people want that, some people don't. What you know about me will affect that because the more you have an actual relationship with people, the better you can have a more sort of robust consent framework with them. But this is the situation where the agreement and boundaries were set and the parents are changing the terms of the negotiation that they had. They're changing the consent in a way that is not very consensual. And they're doing so in a way that shows no awareness of the impact they're likely to have on their child. Carlin, you said parents so often feel entitled to their adult children's time, attention, and affection as if they are owed it for raising them, but absolutely no one ever asked to be born, no one asked to be raised. I mean, exactly. It's one of those things where it's like it's nice if your adult kids want to give it to you, but they don't owe it to you. Okay. I asked them if they could cancel because I thought we'd already established that I would be coming over, and he says no. He then says I should be more understanding because mom has fibromyalgia, and the cold makes her pain worse, and the heat will make it better. Okay. Sure, that is true, but that doesn't excuse this, and it's not even a reason for doing this, because then why are they not going away every winter? After that, I called my mom, and I'm going to be honest here. I said some really unkind things and called her a selfish bitch, among other things, for making me spend nearly $200 and have me go through all that effort only for them to cancel on me last minute. I demanded an apology and a full payback of all the money. Apparently, that hurt her feelings, and she hasn't talked to me all year. Then my dad called me and said he had a talk with his therapist and that his therapist told him ignore my angry outburst and not give in to my demands because, quote, people with PTSD can't think rationally. You know, A good therapist probably wouldn't say this because people with PTSD absolutely can think rationally. Um, People really like to weaponize comfort that therapists give them. This is also something that's really problematic because a therapist will often validate you. And validating does not mean they agree with you. They're simply saying your experience of reality is what you experienced. Your experience is real. It's not saying, and I think you're correct. It's just saying, yeah, that's what you experienced. And so I think that it's one of those things where people can weaponize this. They can take being validated as proof of agreement sometimes, which is tricky. But also, like, this is just ridiculous. The number of like angry dads who traumatize their children who then also turn around and weaponize PTSD is just too damn high. And weaponized therapy, I mean, not PTSD. Like they give their kids the PTSD and then they weaponize the stuff that's in therapy. Uh, as a teenager, I did some like group family therapy as a kid. My parents really wanted me to get that because they were divorced and it was a tricky divorce and they wanted to make sure everything was good. And I saw it all the time. I saw these dads who would just be literally weaponizing things therapists said. Like their kids set a boundary with them and they would be like, "You're invalidating me." And I would just be like, "Wow." And the therapist would often not respond to that. And which then made me angry. And then I would usually say to them, "Why the fuck are you just letting this thing happen? Do you not have extra like ethical responsibility here? Like, are you not supposed to say anything?" Anyway, yes. Setting it aside, Critwitch, this is all kinds of oof, definitely, and Krellin definitely not the asshole this time. I would agree. Um, this morning, I woke up to a text from my dad asking me if I want to come over for the holidays. No cancellations this time. I told him to fuck off until they both apologized for canceling on me last year for the thing he said about my PTSD and to pay me back for last year. He refused and gave me a written lecture that I'm just holding a grudge and should get over it because it was, quote, a misunderstanding and we're family. But I absolutely refuse to, and I told him not to text me again unless it's an apology. Am I the asshole? So this is good boundary setting. I would say here that this person is definitely setting a boundary, which is saying like, hey, unless you're going to treat me with respect, I don't want to invest in this relationship anymore. And like, here's what, and is also very clear. It's like, here's how I would feel respected for you to take accountability for the impact that your non consensual actions had on me. That's pretty legit. That's like good. And this person is trying very hard, right? Carlini said, changing your holiday plans 2 days prior is not a misunderstanding. Absolutely. And to me, this does not sound like the kinds of people who have the level of self-awareness to likely be able to develop the relationship in the way that the OP would feel comfortable with. And this is one of the things that's also really tough. Like the holidays create this extra pressure for things like togetherness. A lot of people will weaponize the holidays and be like, you should come and spend them with me. Otherwise, you don't love me and you're a piece of shit. And like, there's a bunch of bullshit that happens. I absolutely agree with you, Krellin. This is not just a misunderstanding. Saying these things are not okay. Maybe the OP could apologize to his mom for calling her a selfish bitch, but like, or maybe the bitch part, not the selfish part, because that's kind of true. Um, but I feel kind of bad because the parents left, but it sounds like the siblings still are in the area, so it would be cool if they could, get together. And I totally agree, Krillin. If you can just fly last minute off to a Caribbean island, $200 is not a burden on you, geez. Yeah, Paladin Hulk. What a bunch of expletives. And so this is one of those situations where it's tough. So I think I posted this in the comments, but if you all want to, always I encourage you to join the conversations on Reddit and talk about things from a consent lens. It's one thing for a account named Consent Academy to come in and like talk about things from a consent lens, but I think it's also really good for other people to do that and to really bring consent into these topics. Um, so I would definitely say, yeah, yeah, I don't know. This OP is definitely not the asshole. They definitely deserve an apology from their family. They really should. Yeah, and then like parents that give you PTSD and then like can't, how do I want to say this? I spent a lot of time talking to my therapist about these kinds of things years ago, and my therapist once said to me that parents basically will never be able to acknowledge their children's pain, especially pain that they caused. There are exceptions, but for the most part, it's because we have this narrative that parents are supposed to protect their children from all pain and suffering. And when they fail to do that, especially if they're the source of that, it tends to really eat them up inside. My response to that is definitely, if you're not a parent yet or your kids are really young, get over that shit. Just get over it. Like, there's no way that your kid is not going to grow up with some kind of hangups. Everybody gets hangups. It's never going to be the things you think it's for. It's going to be some random thing you said while like half asleep that you thought was just like an offhand comment that your kid will come to you 20 years later and be like, this fucked me up my whole life. And you just got to own it. Like, it's going to happen. Just own it. Um, and also recognize your kids are going to be different people than you. Your kids are going to have a different experience of reality than you, and that is not an indictment of who you are as a person. And you got to respect it. Also, Whistler, I definitely think you're onto something. You said, I'm wondering if that's part of the problem. If $200 is not a problem for them, it's probably harder for them to understand why it would be a problem for someone else. Yeah, I mean, I think that's also probably part of it. Paladin Hulk, hangups are pretty common, but have you seen the amount of hangovers? Yeah. And so this person being a student with chronic illnesses, it also sounds like their context is not being taken into consideration, right? This is also one of the aspects of like power dynamics and consent, which is that like the parents have a lot more power, right? They're parents, first of all. They're Krellin, amazing. They have more life experience. They're probably more financially stable. They're less probably precarious. Like if they can afford to just go off on a Caribbean visit, I imagine that they have a lot more stability across a lot of aspects of their life. And yeah, I don't know, man. OP, I am sorry. Your parents seem kind of like dickheads. Um, you did a good job setting boundaries with them, and I think that this is difficult. They don't understand this person's context. They're not taking into account this person's health problems, including mental health problems, while simultaneously saying, you can't get mad at us because you have to just completely agree with your mother's context with there's no negotiation there, right? None of this was negotiated, so it's not consensual. And yeah, so let's see what people in the chat or in the comments are saying. The first person said, not the asshole. It sounds like your dad's therapist isn't a good one and gives him selfish advice, assuming he was completely honest with them about what happened. It's pretty obvious that your parents are still bad for your mental health, and you'd be better off being completely no contact with them indefinitely. So I would definitely say, like, this is probably not good for the OP's mental health. Being no contact with them indefinitely, this may be best for this person, but it might not be. I think that there is a tendency to go one of two extremes of like you should never cut off people who are your family because like family is the only thing that matters. You got to always be there for family no matter how they treat you. That's not true. But then there's this other idea that's like if your family mistreats you or mistreated you, what's wrong with you if you don't cut them off? And I don't think that's always correct either, because I think that there are people where the middle is what makes sense for them, where they can recognize that things were difficult, that their parents mistreated them. They can say, here's the reality of who my parents are as people. And here's the reality for my parents are as people. I have to accept who they are and then without judgment and then decide what kind of relationship do I want to have with them based off of their reality and then make a decision there. And it might be something like I'm down to video chat with them once in a while and like exchange Christmas cards and kind of leave it at that. It could be I want to give them, small amounts of in-person contact. It could be I want to chat with them every day. What's going to be best for somebody is going to differ. For some people, it's really important for them to not lose contact with certain family members. And for other people, it really depends. I'm going to give my parents a lot more wiggle room than I give like aunts and uncles, right? Like I have some aunts that I don't talk to because they pulled a bunch of real shitty ass bullshit and they're never gonna apologize for it. Not even necessarily to me, just like in general, that I'm just like, nope. And but I would, I'm much more interested and it's much more important to me to have a good relationship with my parents. And there are limits, of course, that I would be like, okay, if they've crossed this sort of boundary, I wouldn't want to maintain that relationship. But yeah. Okay, there's some stuff in the chat. Whistler said, is this a consent issue though, or is it just being garden variety hurtful? From a consent perspective, the parents have a right to revoke their own consent. Are they assholes for doing so? For sure, it is a consent. Is it a consent issue though? So I know Krellin has said that I already addressed this, but I do want to say, like, yes, they also have a right to say no. They are allowed to say, you know what, I changed my mind. They could just say, like, I want to be alone for the holidays. They could say, like, I got COVID and I don't want anyone coming over. Like, you're allowed to change your mind, but you have to actually communicate about it. And you actually have to, like, talk about it, right? And, like, if you're thinking about changing your mind, it's good to let the people know. Good consent practice here, right? Like they're still allowed to change their mind. It's absolutely within their autonomy to decide we want to go off to the Bahamas or the Caribbean for the holidays and we've got this opportunity and there's these tickets. But you got to actually involve the other people who are going to be affected by the situation. Krellin said Ariana already touched on that, Whistler, because the parents are changing a pre-existing consent agreement, so they are responsible to be the ones making sure consent is still valid. And that's, again, what I would still say is like, they have the right to change it. They have the right to even revoke their consent to their kid coming into their house. They could just be like, I'm not in the mood anymore. And there are going to be effects of this kind of thing, right? Like, to say that because remember, we're like my autonomy ends where someone else's begins, and anytime it overlaps, we have to negotiate. So this is a good case where these two groups of people's autonomy really heavily overlaps. This person is like probably taking time off from whatever work that they're doing. They're, taking money out of their savings. They're going and buying things that were asked for. They're like making these arrangements. And they're being left high and dry, and that's not even being respected. And these parents should take our class on how to take a good apology. Yeah, Jerry, you said, I do wonder if there's some sort of mania going on in the parents' part. Someone deciding to go on a Caribbean trip in 2 days' time doesn't sound like entirely neurotypical behavior. This doesn't excuse the behavior, it's just a side thought. So I do think I want to talk about this a little bit because I think this is a really important point as well. When people have mental health issues, there's a lot of things that they're not going to be able to help, right? There are things that, any mental health issue can cause us to do that we can't necessarily help. It doesn't excuse impact that we necessarily have. We may still need to make amends for things we do under, say, something we did during psychosis. Now, whether you're going to be held, like, say, criminally culpable for something you did in a state of psychosis versus like interpersonally responsible, these are kind of different things. And I'm not talking about like the criminal sort of side of this, but if I got really depressed, or if I were in a state of like such extreme self-loathing, for example, and someone was trying to be kind to me and I lash out at them, I, when I feel better later, I still should apologize, even if it's caused by depression. I have ADHD, and that makes it so I can be really impulsive about things and really forgetful. I regularly forget. And well, I'm better about it now, but I used to regularly forget to do things that Charlie would ask me to do. He would be like, "Hey, can you please do some laundry today?" Like, because I've worked from home the whole time we've lived together. He'd be like, "I'm really desperate. I realized as I was getting dressed this morning that I didn't have any clean underwear. Like, could you please do it? Because if you don't do it now, it won't be dry for the morning." And there were times where I forgot. And I don't just get to say, "I have ADHD, you can't get mad at me." But what it means is we have extra information that then tells us how we need to negotiate this, what are the bumpers we need to put in place to make sure that more consent incidents don't happen, or that, it's not necessarily a consent incident, except I said I would do it and then I didn't. But, and I didn't necessarily have a good reason, like, oh, like wasn't at home the whole day, and it was like I didn't put structures in place. I have some responsibility for my behavior there. But it's I think it's also tough because when we try to have these conversations, sometimes people get stuck in imagining really outsized responses, and outsized responses are often things that happen. If I forgot to do laundry one time, if Charlie came in and started like yelling at me or insulting me, that would be a really outsized response. When, the real solution was we did laundry and then we borrowed a blow dryer from the neighborhood and I sat there and blow dried some underwear. Like, I think that's what we did. And because Charlie and I take the regard for each other that we're always going to treat each other as though we're on the same team, and we're going to really take that mindset. So we focus on solutions and building structure rather than blame and hostility. But I still apologized and gave a genuine apology. Now, sort of coming back to it is like, if I say, so let's say I had psychosis and I was the kind of person who got really like angry and really paranoid during states of psychosis. Now, if I'm not able to like take any kind of accountability for that, and I'm not able to create structures to prevent me from hurting people, that's when you get into like the state is likely to want to be involved and to impose structures upon you, usually by putting you in some sort of mental health facility until you're stabilized enough. These things can often be very non-consensual, and they do not necessarily make the situation better. In fact, a lot of the time they make it worse. But the sort of like theory behind it is, if you can't create these boundaries to make sure you're not violating other people's consent, we will come in and do it for you. Okay, so why I bring this example up is that there are going to be people who are going to need help maintaining these boundaries. But if I'm going to have a consent discussion with somebody, for example, like if I'm negotiating sex with someone, and if they have trauma related to sex, which, generally speaking, one of the ways to be trauma informed is to assume it is more likely than not that the person you're interacting with has a history of trauma, because that's just kind of true. It would be important for me to know, if you know, hey, don't like touch me in this kind of way because it triggers me. You could tell me that, but people don't always know. People don't always know what all their triggers are, and they can kind of come at random. And the same thing can be true with things like mania. People cannot always tell when it's happening. Or me with my migraines. Like, sometimes I get warning signals days in advance, and sometimes it just comes on me like all of a sudden, and I can't always prepare for it. But yeah, if I'm trying to negotiate with somebody for sex, it would be good to talk about this. Like, do you have sexual trauma? We don't need to get into it right now, but like, we can talk about it later, but like, are there ways you typically respond if that is triggered? Do you want to have, even for very vanilla sex, like a safe word to just say to stop? That can be really helpful. For even for completely vanilla sex, these things are really useful to talk about. And the reason why I'm bringing up this example is if there is this kind of situation with the father or the mother or both of them, if there is this kind of like mania, impulsivity kind of situation happening, it would be important for that to be communicated to the son, or I think it's a son, to the kid. I don't think they ever say um, that this is a risk, right? This is a risk. We might just flake on you. I've had friends that I knew that that kind of thing was a risk. And so I would always decide, do I want to go spend time with them knowing that they might bail on me on the last second? And sometimes I would be willing to take that risk, and sometimes I would not. And that was important for it to be valid consent, is needing to know these sorts of things. Um, Aradin, you said, I also wonder if this was something coming mostly from the father, who still, it seems, has a strained relationship and is using his wife's condition as an excuse. Yeah, it can be hard to know. I mean, as we always said, there's always say with these, there's always more that would be nice to know because we can't really speculate. So all I can ever really do is just talk about it purely from the consent perspective. Um, yeah. So, you know, this is pretty non-consensual, not good consent practices here. The OP is setting boundaries with their family, good boundaries to be setting, and I hope that the parents respect it. And I hope that the OP feels comfortable, you know, uh, maintaining those boundaries, even if they get pressure. Even if they get pressure from, like, say, siblings. Sometimes that happens where siblings will come in and be like, hey, you shouldn't set this kind of boundary. I never do that. If I have family members who, if I talk to both people, but they don't talk to each other, the most I will ever do is maybe very gently ask, is there any interest in reconnecting? Or say to them, hey, if you ever have interest in reconnecting with this other person, feel free to let me know. And I would be happy to facilitate that. But I'm not going to try to encourage either person either way. I'm not going to say, no, you shouldn't talk to them, or yes, you should. If they don't want me sharing information about them with the other person, I don't. Beyond something like, yes, this person is alive and well. Um, that's about it. That's really how I respect that, because that's also part of those boundaries. And sometimes siblings can be real shit about this because they can feel like they have to manage stuff. Ice Bunny said Thanksgiving is trash, like everything coming from the USA. Hey, I'm from the USA. I hope you don't think I'm trash. And Krellin, isn't your boyfriend from the USA, Ice Bunny? Yeah. Um, so yeah, this is the holidays. Like we said, they create a lot of pressure. We talked about that post. I think I may have closed it already. Sorry. About feeling really lonely on the holidays. And I think that these kinds of problems are really common and they exacerbate a lot of this. So anyway, there are a couple of others that I thought were interesting. This person was, being expected to give up seats, especially when they bought an extra seat, and there's some fat phobia involved in the whole situation. There was this one about someone, am I the asshole for telling my brother's girlfriend that Christmas isn't the meal to be cheap? There's a lot of am I the asshole posts that include a lot of classism in them, which I feel is fascinating. So there's classism, but there's also just like, depending on what social class you come from, will affect your experience of reality and your value system. And, I grew up with sort of like a lot of upper class values, but in poverty, which is really common, right? That's the whole like, a tragedy of like the rich family that fell from grace. Now, it was not exactly that my family was rich and fell from grace, but that historically some of my family members had instilled certain types of values maybe a couple hundred years ago. Uh, like some of my family members were considered like the Boston Brahmins, like the founders of New England and everything. So there was that. But then my family was poor as shit. And like we couldn't afford to feed our house or heat our house in the winter a bunch of times and stuff. And like had difficulties. So it's like I know these clashes, right? Because I grew up with both at the same time. And I can see how they clash in a lot of people and how that is a consent issue as well, because it's two people's autonomy to decide how they feel comfortable in certain scenarios, what's going to make them feel like something like reality around them is correct. And neither one is necessarily more real or good or better. And it can become a difficult way to intersect and a difficult way to, yeah, connect. Rodden, you said the US is a very good example of the fact that surrounding can be very sorry, I just need to read this from the beginning. The US is a very good example of the fact that something can be very problematic in the broad sense, but really amazing in the individual sense, as some of the most incredible people I know are Americans. Yes, I would agree, Rodden. Okay. The next one, am I the asshole for sitting on my husband's lap during Thanksgiving dinner because all the chairs at the table were taken? I think this is also an interesting one. And I had one other open. Am I the asshole for not letting my dad drink my medication for a headache? I would also say here, just like full stop, not the asshole. A lot of the time, it's like literally a major crime to share meds. And not being comfortable with that is you're okay, right? You're not the asshole for not wanting to do that. But I think that these are all interesting and they present interesting consent discussions. I'm going to stop here for today. Thank you all so much for joining me. Feel free to follow us on social media or give us a follow here if you are interested. We have, today the class is already actually literally happening right now, which is how to make a good apology, but we teach this a lot. Next weekend on Saturday, we have our Beyond the Ban Options for Accountability class. So check out our website with our schedule to see what's coming up. So if you're interested, even if you're not an organizer or in any kind of leadership, Beyond the Ban is basically about like when harm happens and people need to take accountability. What do we do when we don't want to necessarily ban somebody from a community or do nothing? What are the in-between options? And these are things that can also apply to you individually. And then what else do we got coming up? Next Tuesday. No, is this next Tuesday? Yes, next Tuesday, this Tuesday, we have the class Supporting Survivors of Sexual Trauma. It's also one I really recommend. As I mentioned earlier in the stream, part of being trauma informed is assuming anyone you're interacting with is more likely to have a history of trauma than not. And a lot of the trauma can be sexual trauma. So knowing how to interact with that's a really good skill to have, but also for yourself if you've experienced sexual trauma. And then hopefully next Sunday we will be doing a watch party. The movie I really wanted to watch with you all is no longer available on Amazon Prime, and we're really limited to that. So I'll have to find another movie. If there's a movie that you think would provide an interesting discussion around consent, feel free to send me the recommendations either on social media or Discord. And then, yeah, I'll talk to you all on Tuesday. Thank you. And bye.